Welcome, Christian DuPont and the Burns librarian. Welcome to the Burns Library on behalf of many of our staff and faculty from around campus, of course. Many of you have been here before, but on every occasion like this is to see new faces. Siobhan, I'm meeting first time, and several of you met for the first time, which means you're bringing friends as well here, right? And I know that some of our faculty, like over at BU, are telling you got to come to this lecture tonight. So my always fear in starting these events, is anybody going to show up, kind of thing. But in fact, this crowd again exceeds all expectations and sort of exceeds a little bit the seating capacity here. So thanks for your patience and huddling together. I think we actually enjoy that here, right? Even in the Irish room. And apologies, because those who came in first, not any shaming here, but you were hungry and you kind of swooped in on the appetizers. So, to thanks to Colleen and our catering staff this evening, very quickly, dispatched the kitchen and brought out the cheese tray and other orders there. So our BC catering really takes very good care of us. So thank you to them as well here. I'm the introducer of the introducer, so keep my remarks here well, because our introducer does very fulsome introductions and really helps to set up the speaker in very beautiful ways, because oftentimes, when you hear a speaker introduced, it's kind of the crinkling of the pocket and you're reading off the bio sort of thing, which you've already read in the event here. What I'm going to simply say is, in bringing Pat Palmer here in a moment, she's number 47. You got the joke, right? Okay. So the real 47. She's the 47th Burns Visiting Scholar in Irish Studies. Okay. So you're turning as red as your Jacobean jacket here this evening. So enough said. I think the rest will be said by Professor Guy Biner, whom the Sullivan Chair of Irish Studies, whom I will ask to come and proceed with a proper introduction of our speaker here. All right? Thank you. So we will, again, relax in your seats. Pat's got a great talk for us. The reception is over downstairs, so go on to dinner and do other things, that to say. But we can linger in conversation afterwards, okay? And if you need assistance getting to the elevator afterward or restrooms and everything, find myself. Caroline Pace, our administrative assistant, will help as well here, okay? Again, Guy, please. Thank you.
So I've been given the daunting task of introducing the great Pat Palmer, and I found myself rereading her previous publications, which have influenced me a lot, even though I'm not at all in the period, and it really has made me think. So Pat has come to us from the University from Maynooth University, as it's now named, and she's the chair of Renaissance Studies, but before that she was in the King's College in London, where she was a reader, an appropriate title for somebody who deals with literature, isn't it, a reader? And before that, she was in York, and before that, she was in Oxford, and before that, she was in Cork. So it's quite a trajectory that brings you over to us. I first encountered Pat's work when I finished my PhD, and I encountered in the library at UCD an incredible book, Language and Conquest in Early Modern Ireland. English Renaissance Literature and Elizabethan Imperial Expansion, if we give the full title.
It was all about search words.
Yeah, everything had to be there. It still is for publishers in many ways, but it really struck me because it made me think a lot about language. It made me think about the early modern language. I know there's a few early modernists here in the room. I saw John, I saw Mary, and I saw others, but it really made me think about language and about the facts of what happens, about the reality of what happens in Ireland and in the British Isles in the early modern period with the Elizabethan conquest. A lot has been written from the point of view of history about the Elizabethan conquest, but that this is the moment where really English begins this long process of displacing Irish, which you follow there. And at the same time, there's an expansion. There's a displacement and expansion of English becoming this colonial imperial language. And Pat documents this in remarkable ways as she kind of shows us the role of the English language in colonial expansion and in creating national identity. And that struck me very strongly in her first book. And as she follows this kind of this linguistic, what she calls linguistic colonization is, I think, the word that I learned from that book. But she follows it into the New World. And she follows it also with other languages, with the use of Spanish, and the role that languages from Europe play as they move into the New World and displace other languages. I remember specifically the chapter that you had on representations of Irish in Elizabethan texts. And then the Elizabethan evaluations of Irish, what you called wild speech. Remember that chapter, wild speech. And the book ended appropriately with clamorous silence, which is remarkable. Because when we think of displacement of languages, the image is often of silence. People can no longer use the indigenous and vernacular languages that they had before. Worlds pass away. And that's often our image of what happens in the New World. Partly because we're locked in a world of literacy and we don't have documentation. But in the case of the Gaelic world, we find that actually the clamorous silence was quite noisy. It was clamorous. And that struck me very strongly. Some years later, I encountered another book, The Severed Head and the Grafted Tongue, which again struck me, this blew my head completely, this book. I think you stole the title from John Montague, from The Rough Field, right? It's from the poem from The Rough Field. Yes. Because it's a wonderful title. But when we think of the Elizabethan conquest in Ireland, from an historical point of view, we know, and this sounds very early modern, but in a way it's very much contemporary. We know it was a brutal conquest. It would involve what we would call today ethnic cleansing, or as we turn to use even more now, genocide. That was what was happening on the ground. Or to use another word, it was state terror. It was brutal in every way, which makes it very contemporary, even though it seems so remote from a world in the past. But it's remarkably contemporary, and the image that strikes us from this period is exactly one of severed heads. We find English colonists coming over to Ireland, appalled at the barbarity of the Irish, constantly complaining about the barbarity of the Irish, and at the same time are asking for trophy heads wherever they go, executing and beheading people everywhere, and turning this into a case that if you don't behead them, then telling the people who come in to surrender to submit heads all the time, to bring them in. And you see this in Derrick's famous woodcuts. You see Dublin Castle coated with severed heads. It's a shocking and appalling sight in every way, these kind of terrible, terrible sights. And what does this mean for literature? Especially as we associate the Elizabethan period as this golden age of literature. All these refined writers, what do they write? How do they comment on this? And of course, Edmund Spenser immediately comes up. We think of Spenser and how he comments on this. The refined author of The Fairy Queen and where those severed heads fit into that. But what Pat does remarkably, I think, is her attention to translation in this book. Looking at various translations and not just treating them as a translation. A translation is never a translation. It's exactly as a translation in its real sense, meaning it's not just linguistic. It's cultural, and it's a commentary in many forms. But she brings our attention that when you look at, for example, Sir John Harrington's translation from Italian of Ludovico Ariosto's Orlando Furiosa, or Sir George Caro's translation from Spanish of Alonso de Ercilla de Arancana, the book about Chile, about the conquest of Chile. So we look at these books which are coming out, or even in the case of Richard Stanihurst, which is interesting, who's an Anglo-Irishman who goes into exile on the continent. And while he's on the continent, he translates Virgil's Aeneid. And you take these texts, and each one is supposedly just a translation, but each translation is remarkably current on its commentary and what they focus on, the use of language. Now, the severed head appears in all of these cases as they try to understand the world around them through a translation of another text, which is remarkable. Now, I have to say, that book was a hard read for me. It's horrific, the descriptions which are there, and yet remarkably contemporary. When I read it 10 years ago, we were seeing snuff videos, whether we liked or not, of beheadings, of ISIS beheadings, wherever we went. At the same time, Game of Thrones was all the rage. We were all watching, which ended with season 1 with a terrible beheading. We were all watching for this moment. Will it be a beheading or not? So you're watching beheadings. Even though I have to say, if we're talking about macabre entertainment, the best piece I enjoyed in the book, my favorite, beheading. It's the Siege of Boulogne. in 1544. Do you remember your reference to that one? So there's the siege of Boulogne in France, and there's a Galician, a French Goliath. A giant stands there and challenges the other army, find me a champion to fight against me. And an Irishman called Welsh, so he's an Irishman from Welsh origin, I gather, swims over the river, fights him, slays him, beheads him, and swims back. And he's an Irishman who works in the service of the Lord of Kildare, so it's Pale Irish, working for a Welshman who's Irish, working for a man of the Pale, Old English, fighting a French enemy, swims back across the river and carries the head in his teeth, which you say takes some kind of dogged, or you say doggily. He swims over doggily with the hair in his head as he brings it back, which is, that image still stays with me. But what's remarkable about that book as well is if the first book ended in clamorous silence, that book again returns to the vernacular language, to the laments, to the elegies in Gaelic, Irish, of interpreting what's happening around and this loss of language and displacement as it's happening around them, and this shocking, all the shock and horror. The last word is again left to a local response. Since then, Pat has moved over and assembled a whole army of her own, a team of people for the MacMorris project. MacMorris, those who know the Shakespeareans. John is here somewhere. Where's John? I've got to say, I've got to make eye contact here. There you go. So of course, MacMorris, What Ish My Nation, right? The original stage Irishman, but a remarkable project of mapping over the course of 150 years. Am I correct? This goes until the end of the 17th century, right? From the mid 1660 would be the cutoff date. From the 16th century, you cover 150 years of various usages of language in Ireland. And if anything I can gather is we're waiting to see the fruits of that project, but as it's emerging, first of all, it's a digital humanities project, which is remarkable in terms of mapping. And I really have to thank Pat for introducing to students, and I see quite a few of her students around here in the audience who are taking the course now here. I think it's remarkable if you introduce these tools of digital mapping to our students, which is remarkable. And the ways of, I've had conversations with students talking about deep mapping, a context I didn't know before, and how it works. And you can click and understand things. I'm understanding different ways of reinterpreting the data that people have been collecting, which is remarkable. But it also makes us rethink the early modern in terms of plurality, both linguistically and culturally. That's what I think we're going to see in this project, a huge plurality. It's much more complicated than we'd seen before. So with that in mind, we're ready for Pat's lecture, though I have something to say about that as well, if I could just briefly. A little bit more. So I'm excited about this notion of land turning into property, especially because surrender and regrant, I think the first course I ever took at UCD as a student was learning this term surrender and regrant. What does that mean for earlier notions of property, and how does that change? So we're all curious to see what you're going to make out of this. But I have one comment. So this is my favorite historian of the early modern period. Harvard man, we have here representatives from Harvard. He did a few, Robert Darnton, Bob Darnton's book. He had a book called The Kiss of Lamorette in 1990. And I often think about that book because there's a chapter, it's a collection of essays. There's a chapter there where he looks back at his tenure as the editor of Princeton University Press. And it's a beautiful piece in which he looks at what titles were accepted and what were rejected. And it's advice for new academics, for grad students. How should you title your work if you want it to be accepted? And he gives this wonderful piece of advice. Page 99 of the essay. Notice the prevalence of P's with the carryover of the alliteration from the main title to the subtitle. It's what I call the Peter Piper principle. And with that in mind, we are privileged to hear tonight the poetics of property, the ground possessed and dispossessed in early modern Ireland by Pat Palmer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Guy. For one glorious moment, I thought you were going to give the lecture, which would have been just splendid. Thank you for that generous and kind of frightening introduction. If I could ask you one favor, it would be that I can take a picture of that book with all those bits of paper sticking out of it.
We're going to get this out of your way for the video camera.
Okay, all right, okay, thank you. Is that, okay. But I want to thank Guy for another reason, which is for the invitation to be here, and to all in Connolly House. It has been one of those experiences where you wonder why Americans think, why Irish people, when Americans come to Ireland, why they think it's friendly. Because I really haven't experienced friendliness like it, I must say, for a very long time. So I'm very grateful to you all for that reception. And also to the Burns Library, to the people who got me so many of the scans that are behind the poetry that I'm looking at and calling up the books tonight, and also to Christian for being the most solicitous and attentive genius loci. And to my students, I'm delighted to see are here tonight, which means they've got 2 classes this week, which is awful. And I'm really grateful to them for enduring my obsessions for a whole term. And they realize as the night goes on that they've really been the ones who've been writing this paper all term. So thank you very much. The one thing that I haven't got, however, I haven't been given in my period here is optimism. That much vaunted American optimism. And so I start the paper in a rather bad place, which is to acknowledge that things are not looking good, things are not going well. The world is burning, and Andreas Malm calls what he calls fossil capitalism is carrying the day. Against such a background, I wonder what on earth you are all doing here tonight, coming to a talk about early modern Ireland. All I can say is that when I think of the past, these slogans come into my mind uncommonly often. Another world is possible. It was popping up everywhere about 10 years ago when Guy was reading the book, but now it seems more like a taunt. Were we really ever that naive? But if we change the tense of that assertion, it doesn't seem at all so implausible. Another world, another past was possible. The present that now seems so hegemonic and unassailable was once an open-ended muddle of paths not taken and outcomes that turned on a sixpence. Nothing was predestined, none of this was inevitable. And if other paths were possible, so too were very different futures. We are not as locked in as we think. So this evening, I want to go to one of the places where our present was being shaped, to the laboratory of the Capitalocene, as Jason Moore calls it, that was early modern Ireland. Modern Ireland was forged in the violence, displacement, and plantations of its early modernity. And what was trialled in Ireland offered a blueprint for colonial exploitation in the New World, and thereby for what would become our modernity. William Petty put Francis Bacon's new empirical methods into practice as he was Surveyor General of Ireland, serving the vast tracts of land confiscated from the Irish in preparation for the Cromwellian plantation. Petty made no bones about what he was doing. He was using Ireland as a laboratory for how to extract value from land. And this is what he said. As students of medicine practice their inquiries upon cheap and common animals, and such whose actions they were best acquainted with, and where there is the least confusion and perplexure of parts, I have chosen Ireland as such a political animal. Radically new conceptions of ownership and property, new ethnically defined theories and practices of social segregation, new military technologies, and a dramatically altered relationship with the land and its provisions, all these were field-tested in Ireland before being adopted for export to the Caribbean, North America, and elsewhere. What was being brought into existence was nothing less than a wholesale reconceptualization of what and for whom the world exists. But how exactly was that done? At one level, the story is simple. Henry VIII was declared King of Ireland in 1541, stutteringly at first, then escalating into first the Desmond Wars and then the 9 Years' War. The Tudor conquest of Ireland kept its eye on the prize. And that was what Edmund Spenser called Ireland's, I quote him, goodly and commodious soil. As native lords were brought to heel, their land was confiscated and redistributed to English planters. It's a story we can tell in two maps. This first one, and I apologize to my students who've had these maps until they're blue in the face, but this first one is Robert Lythe, his extraordinarily detailed map of Munster, made in 1571 for Sir Henry Sidney, who was advancing the conquest like nobody else. And what you'll notice in it is so detailed in naming all of the people who owned the land. Owned is a problem word. But the people who were the native landowners, Old English and Gaelic Irish. And if we just switch a few years to this map, we see what Sachs calls the empty-bill places of capitalism. All of that has been cleared away. All of those names have been cleared away. I mean, they're still on the ground, but they've been reduced by the Desmond Wars. Famine and bloodshed has reduced the land to this blank place which can be colonized. And the writing, the terrible Crabbit writing you see on it, is the hand of Sir William Burleigh, who is Elizabeth's chief secretary, and he's writing. He's been lobbied for grants of land, and he's writing, so and so desires this part, and so forth. So that's the redistribution of Gaelic and Old English lands after the plantation. So you can see how that emptying of land and then this kind of replacement of its population is part of the story that we're telling today. Successive plantations, Laois Offaly, Munster, Ulster, the Cromwellian plantation, the Williamite plantation, resulted in what Micheál Shocrú calls, I quote him, the largest single shift in land ownership anywhere in Europe and possibly beyond during the early modern period. But to frame this as a shift in land ownership masks just how radical the transformation was. For the concept of ownership in the English sense of the word, didn't exist in Ireland. Irish land law worked very differently. Brehon law was organised around what are known as corporate kin estates or clan groupings. That meant that land was held corporately by the Derivina or the sept. And the lord or the Ceann Finne, the head of the Finne, where the gives us Fine Gael, for example, enjoyed only a life interest in the land. He held it in trust for the sept for the duration of his reign, and every member of the Finne was entitled to a share of that land. The lord was given custody, and no more than that. Orloiv is the word that is used repeatedly in the legal text and in the poetry, custody. It is not in any sense his private property. This collective land tenure system was anathema to the English. Sir John Davies, who was James I's Attorney General in Ireland, prepared the legal ground for the plantation of Ulster, and he regarded Irish land laws as, I quote him, odious and unlawful customs. By then, the colonial authorities had dedicated almost a century to undoing them. From the 1540s, they set about stamping out what Davies called again the barbarous, unreasonable, and intolerable practice of collective ownership through a game-changing policy, and of course Gaia anticipates me, surrender and regrant. Lords were pressurized into surrendering sept land, in which, remember, they enjoyed only a lifetime's interest, to the English monarch. Land, note, that wasn't theirs to surrender. In return, they received letters patent granting them exclusive title to that land under common law in fee tail or fee simple. Surrender and re-grant, therefore, is a misnomer. They were not being re-granted anything, and certainly not the same thing as they had given away. They were getting back something entirely new. Through the alchemy of common law, communal septaland had been magicked into private property, to be passed on by primogeniture to the newly made property owner's heirs. But it came with a sting. What the monarch granted, the monarch could just as easily take away again. As a conquest advanced, as these lords rose in rebellion, and often even when they didn't, those lands were confiscated by the crown and redistributed, now with brand new, legally perfect title to New English colonists. Sometime in the late 1650s, the Kerry poet Sean O'Connell bleakly surveys a broken land. Scris na dira is thee, na cléire, thee hu, na nina is luid angreha. The destruction of the country and the deprivation of the clergy, the annihilation of the people, and the laying waste of its endowments. And he introduced the word that he's talking about. What he begins to talk about then is the imposition of Anglicization. His poem runs from the 1530s, and he surveys through a roll call of defeats. He brings us right up to the present, his terrible, intolerable present, which culminates in Cromwell and Ireton's pitiless campaign. Is iad the Chríochnaigh conquest Asian. And it was they who finished the conquest of Ireland. Conquest in that sentence, you'll have gathered, isn't an Irish word. It's iad the Chríochnaigh conquest Éireann. But O'Connell plants English loanwords throughout his text, like so many self-lacerating taunts. For him, Anglicization is both a cause and an effect of the conquest. And the imposition of English common law is at the heart of that lethal process of Anglicization. Just look at the number of loanwords here. The editor, Cecilia Rahela, has some of them, especially the Latin loanwords, in italics, and I've underlined the rest of them. Actually, it became easier on the right-hand side to just put in brown the words that are actually Irish in the text, because the text is almost written in English, basically, and all of the words that are being used are English legal terms. So naturally, surrender and regrant is at the heart of the problem. And the last 3 lines there is where he talks about it. Dlí beag eile the rinne the Gaelic. Surrender a garth the dhéanamh the chuir sin le huin trí na chéile. Another little law imposed on the Gaels, surrender of their right to make. That turned Ireland upside down. Judicial and extrajudicial manoeuvres tested in the laboratory of 16th and 17th century Ireland were then exported to other sites of colonization, turning them, in turn, upside down. Colonization entailed translating ways of inhabiting the earth that didn't involve owning it into property relations. And the process whereby the theft of Native American land was retroactively rendered legal echoes mutatis mutandis what was going on with surrender and regrant. This is a fantastic book for following that process, and it is uncannily like what was going on. It tracks what went on in this country. The making of land legal, giving it a title, and then saying, I'll have that back. Thank you very much. In Ireland, as in North America, Nichols, this is a quote from Nichols, the colonial world was not just a field of application. That means that it wasn't that they simply rolled out what they did at home. Rather, it is a place where the new mechanisms of dispossession are invented and are violently imposed. What interests me in all of this, however, isn't the legalistic chicanery, fascinating as it is in itself, but the radical and ultimately destructive transformation which that chicanery enabled in our relationship with the earth. To turn the earth into property means to treat it as a commodity and subject it to our insatiable extractive impulses. In the Great Transformation, Karl Polanyi ponders on what it means to translate land as nature into land as property. To do that requires us to perform what he calls an entirely fictitious maneuver, namely turning land, which is, I quote him, only another name for nature, unquote, into a commodity. Writing in the early 1940s, he wonders where it's all going to end. To allow the market mechanism to be the sole director of the fate of human beings and their natural environment would result, he kind of can't believe it would result in the demolition of society. Nature would be reduced to its elements, neighborhoods and landscapes defiled, rivers polluted, military safety jeopardized, the power to produce food and raw materials destroyed. Now the apocalypse he half disbelievingly conjured up is upon us. But as we pick our way through a burning world, a world set alight in no small measure by discourses of exploitation and extraction honed in early modernity, we need to push beyond merely analysing how we got here. Retracing the steps which brought us to this, reconstructing how the earth was turned into property, is not of itself enough. We need to know what the alternatives were, what was needed to fall or be pushed out of history for this to happen. Of course, and it pains me to introduce this, of course, one of the signature slogans of the market economy is, there is no alternative. As Nichols points out, the rise of capitalism as a historical form of life colonizes and consumes actually existing alternatives. I don't know why I left. I don't have another slide for about a page and a half, which is kind of panicking. I'll race through. Yet the scale of the transformation and the destructive assumptions that the land and all the life which it sustained was property, individually owned and detachable from its ecosystem and from the people who had managed it sustainably, forces us to think about what had to be thrown overboard for that to happen. As early modernists, creatures of a double time frame, living in an urgent presence while immersed in the past that shaped, in so many ways, that present, we have a double responsibility. We need to interrogate, certainly, the components from which our modernity was selectively assembled. But at least as importantly, we need to recover the worldviews and lifeways which had to be excluded, rendered archaic, in Raymond Williams' term, for these discourses to become hegemonic. But here is where it gets tricky. Colonization colonizes language as well as land. The letters patent, which magically transformed communal land into private property, almost invariably included a clause requiring the grantees to, I quote from one of them, bring up their children in the use of the English tongue. It's everywhere. The defeat and dispersal of the native aristocracy, the collapse of patronage, and the colonial administration's relentless Anglicisation policy would later imperil the very survival of Irish. But none of that was true in early modern Ireland. Au contraire, Gaelic literary culture was at the height of its powers. But even when the archive exists, as it does copiously for 16th and 17th century Gaelic Ireland, scholars tend to bypass sources made recondite and obscure by defeat. The great Michel Rolf Trouillot's taxonomy of how silences creep into the writing of history is invaluable in pinpointing just how that happens. In the case of Ireland, we have the sources, we have the archive, so those first two causes don't exist. They're bursting to the seams, in fact. This is one of those silences that happens because of the sources that were subalternized in early modernity are recorded what Trouillot calls an unequal frequency of retrieval. And even when they are ferreted out, Trouillot notes, they are afforded unequal factual weight and indeed unequal degrees of factualness, unquote. It's certainly the case that there has been a startling reluctance by scholars, apart from a handful of classical Irish specialists, to engage with that archive. Indeed, there is an unfortunate tendency to move from not retrieving it to asserting that it isn't really worth retrieving in the first place. Take our friend John Patrick Montagnot's The Roots of English Colonization in Ireland, published in 2015, and yes, that's 2015, for Cambridge University Press's Critical Perspectives on Empire series. The only perspective that gets a look in is the empires, and a not particularly critical one at that. His excuse is this, I quote, "The material available for the study of Tudor Ireland is heavily weighed in favour of the English records and accounts because," he claims, I quote, "only a limited number of Gaelic manuscripts were produced by a predominantly oral culture," unquote. 2015. Brehon law, he inexplicably declares, was never written down. Here's some of it written down. So Montagnot retrieves only what he calls the texts of the civilized, one of his favorite terms for les Anglais. English perspectives enter his text only as what he calls the cacophony of barbarous resistance, a cacophony that never even gets a hearing. Instead, Montagnot, channeling his colonial sources, reproduces colonial evaluations. I quote him again, "The Irish, like all barbarians, stubbornly refused or were unable to evolve culturally at the same pace as their more civilized neighbors," unquote. Look, I'm sorry to pick on Montagnot. He's just a representative of this strange and wide-scale refusal to engage with Irish language sources, and indeed, I think, a wide-scale refusal to engage with Ireland qua colony. To illustrate this in a slightly frivolous way, last year The Guardian had an absolutely fabulous series on tracing their own linkage to slavery in particular and the colonial world specifically. And this is and it was a massive splashy thing. It was really good. And it was called Lest We Remember, and Gary Young wrote a superb article about it. But the graphics department, when it came to illustrating it, came up with this. Now, I need a break, so I leave you to find Ireland on the map. Those poor little Guardian reading children are going to have to keep looking harder. Anyway, so it's because of this that this kind of pattern of ignoring early Irish accounts and then, unembarrassed by that ignorance, projecting barbarism and cacophony onto Ireland, that I spent the last 5 years working on the MacMorris project, which Guy mentioned. MacMorris is a digital humanities project that says it seeks to capture the complexity and richness of early modern Ireland by mapping the full range of cultural activity across languages and ethnic groups from 1541 to 1660. The work of retrieval is now largely done. So now it's at the fun stage where we can help the texts which we have recovered to rejoin conversations from which they've long been excluded. So for the rest of this talk, I want to see what Gaelic texts have to say about human engagements with land before that relationship was redescribed in terms of property. And I'm going to look at three cases. Brenna Bhandar, in this excellent book, argues that there cannot be a history of private property law that is not at the same time a history of land appropriation in Ireland. In Ireland, the Caribbean, North America, and beyond. Her focus is on how modern property laws, I'm quoting her, emerge along with and through colonial modes of appropriation. As I say, it is a terrific book, and it is, as she explains, beyond its scope to engage with what she calls indigenous concepts of ownership and relationship to land. Its chapter on Ireland, for example, focuses on our friend William Petty, surveyor for the Cromwellian plantation, and so it engages with a successor phase to surrender and regrant. So I want to spool back to a period before dispossession to see how Gaelic writers theorized the relationship between landholders and the land itself. I want to do so through the lens of bardic poetry, bearing in mind that these poets, referred to in Irish as fili, the highest of the grades of professional poets, or even Oluna professors, were effectively court officials and councillors for their individual lords. The first of the three vignettes I want to look at is Taigdal O'Higgins Inishrod a Ra Ilig Telon O Castle of Ilach. Significantly, like many of these poems, it addresses not the patron, but the patron in this case is Sean O'Doherty, Lord of Inishowen, but the patron's principal castle, Ilach. The relationship that this sets up between the poet and a non-human form in the landscape allows O'Higgins to focus not on the patron, but on the chthonic energies that subtend the castle and indirectly O'Doherty's stewardship of it. O'Higgins speaks directly to the Ra Ardsaw Od Nuita, O ancient bright-lawned castle. He addresses it in the vocative, a hoit, O tower, O tapering tower of smooth, even walls. The extended question and answer that O'Higgins sets up between the poet and the castle is used to explore the castle's history and, crucially, its prehistory. In an extended prosopopeia, the castle talks. And this chatty little castle fills in the history, not just of the present structure, but of its prenatal mound. More arresting than the fact that the castle can talk is that it has memories of its pre-existence. In its narration, the lime-washed castle and the land from which it would eventually rise are inseparable. The talking castle channels energies that precede and infuse it. The castle structures its first-person account of its own prehistory, pre-being a castle, around the mythological invasions, the ones you know from Laur Goala, from the Partholonians to the present. And here he's saying, upon the coming of the Partholonians, I was enduring my misfortune in this land with no enclosed meadow or stone rampart, but all an oaken thicket. The earth from which the castle would eventually emanate already infuses its as yet inchoate instantiation. Its being predates its becoming. It speaks of itself as existing even when, as a castle, it didn't yet exist. The vime, I was, it says, and that I precedes its castellation. So, in the time of the Nemedians, long before its physical incarnation as a castle, I was, it says, a smooth plain without thickets, without woods, the border slope of my bright steed-haunted lea was a splendid mound of assembly. Now, remember, the last one didn't have thickets, so I'm really interested in the fact that it's also writing a history of a world that is not human. I was, the castle tells the poet, empty of house or dwelling, until the Tuatha Danann entered, in the translation, entered into intimacy with me, the Hoid im Hadriv. The Tuatha, the tribe of the gods, are the one-time inhabitants of Ireland who, on their defeat by the last of the invaders, the Miletians, retreated to the underworld to become the Aes She, or what we think very misleadingly translate as the fairies. Theirs is the telluric force that entered into Cadhriv, intimacy, with all its sexual overtones, with the quasi-animate sacred site of Ailach. That miscegenation is at the source of its strange energies. O'Higgin apostrophizes the castle as Ara even and Fasid, O lovely, unsteadied and the Fasid castle. It is unsteadied precisely by the galvanic force of a more than human energy that's fizzing through it. Twice the poet refers to the castle and its environs using the word sheath, fairy, and we need to talk about fairies. It's an embarrassing topic, and both times sheath occurs, Eleanor Knott, the wonderful translator and scholar, backs away from the full force of the word by adding the concessive like, wondrous fairy-like regions and the pleasant fairy-like castle. I understand Knott's fear of frightening the horses. What's kookier than this talk of fairies? But these are not the cobweb-winged fairies of folktale, but powerful chthonic emanations from an underworld ruled by the Tuatha, and they are above all, I think, ways of thinking abstractly, in this case, abstractly about property. Writing of later incarnations of fairy in Irish folktale, Angela Burke tells us that Irish fairy legend floats like a web of story above the physical landscape, pegged down at point after point to specific places, this hill, that lake, yonder cave. Here they constitute an underground web as well, and the whole intellectual thrust of O'Higgin's poem is precisely to provide a genealogy for the telluric forces animating a land in which O'Dohertig is only the latest custodian. Given the primacy and potency of that telluric force, it's not surprising that O'Dohertig is described as having custody, urlov, that word again, not proprietorship of the land. These are not forces which anyone could own. To get a handle exactly on what that chthonic earth energy might be, and to explore its implications, I'd like to turn to a second vignette, this time a mid-17th century poem, Muire O'Higgin's Malert Críocha Luigna. The land of Luigna has changed her appearance. Right from that first line, we realize that the land, Luigna, in southwest Sligo, is not only gendered and animate, but female. The poem's patron, Olil O'Hara, has just returned to Luigna after it had been occupied for some years by the English, and the land, accordingly, has cast off her desolate appearance. She has cast off her sad mien and has checked her mood of lamentation. A grave has changed its look of gloom, and a sad cloud has fled from the sunny hill. The reunion of land and lord is deeply, and we might say queasily, eroticized. The land is spoken of as a beauteous lady, a comely, white-armed, keen-minded girl whose bright hair is uncovered. Their union, it turns out, is long established. For the past 12 years, thou art possessed by the fair-limbed prince, and even though God tried to separate you, It's a 17th century poem, therefore God is mentioned. God is never mentioned in 16th century party poetry. And though God tried to separate you, thou shalt live much longer together, unless it's a religious poem, obviously. Both of you desiring it. Desire pulses through the quatrains. The bright-faced lady is, quote, not ashamed of being crazed with love of her lover. Beyond the feverishness and at times discomfort with which Moel Uira O'Higgin imagines the tangle of limbs, the exposed breast, behind his slight embarrassment in having to urge Alil to respond to Luigna's eagerness and indulge her wishes, lies one of the oldest tropes in Irish mythology, that of the sovereignty goddess. Sovereignty was understood to reside in the land itself. The land and its dominion was embodied in a sovereign figure who could confer what was effectively a chthonic imprimatur on its anointed ruler. The alliance between the ruler and the land was represented, as Princess McConn and others have written, as a sacred marriage, the Bonish Rigi, between goddess and king spouse. The marriage of the earth in the form of a sovereignty entity and the ruler guaranteed another really important concept, the fear flathamen, the ruler's truth, which was made manifest in the fertility of the land. Here, that fear flathamen, the fecundity that attests to the rightness of the ruler, is everywhere in evidence. Red gleam on green hills, a winsome charm on grass-green elf mounds, golden fruit making trees bow low, hazel trees yellow with nuts in cluster, green leaves darkening woods, bright berries in the colouring of oak groves, bright-leaved lands of shining cascades, a perfume from mounds and orchards. And right at the centre of that restoration is Briocht, Sherke, Shiath, Faruina. And I've gone back to it because I'm picking a bone with a woman I wouldn't like to pick a bone with normally, Eleanor Knott, in her translation, because you'll have noticed that she calls it elfmans, which is, again, that embarrassment about dealing with fairies. Translated literally, it's incantations or magic love spells on the grass-green fairy mounds. So once again, we have that strong telluric magic of the sheath. Channeling all of those forces, Olil O'Hara is imagined to have near shamanic powers. O thou for whom the weather changes, O thou who makes the constellations' anger fade away. And so to one last vignette, one last figure, Donal MacCorrigh Moore, lord of a land of mountains and lakes and rocky shores in South Kerry and West Cork. He's someone who crosses over between worlds and languages, between Irish and English, realpolitik and poetry, land as nature and land as property, in a way that helps to bring some of these threads together. Summoned to London in the spring of 1565, MacCorrigh was pressured into surrendering lands which Elizabeth then re-granted him, along with the title Earl of Clancair, which caused him a great embarrassment when he came home. They'd never heard of anything so ludicrous. When he died in 1596, Angus Fionn-O'Dálaigh, the last hereditary poet, of the last MacCorrigh Moore, 28th of his name, responded with a magnificent 52-quatrain elegy, Sarith led Céile a Cashel, farewell to thy spouse, O Cashel. Following the pattern we've seen earlier, the poet addresses his elegy, to a castle, a Ra na Giagraha, O fort of kings, O satin tapestried palace. The castle with whom the poet commiserates is not the lakeside castle in Killarney, in which MacCorrigh actually lived, but Cashel Moon, the historic seat of the long vanished kings of Munster. Not only is Cashel apostrophized, it, she, is addressed as a woman. Cashel is a wife that has newly become a widow. Sorid led Hela a Hashel, the Hailish, the Hed Vuintir. Farewell to thy spouse, O Cashel, who knows not of thy sorrow. Thou hast lost thy husband, O woman partnered with the Macorig. Desolation has darkened her Hnúsh Gil, her bright face, but nonetheless, the identity of the castle woman soon becomes clear. A hollock greenach hialtash, the vert allin arachtas, a thaw na mert horica hov. O sunny bright hill, O thy fair vestment of sovereignty is now a mourning garb, thy sorrow cannot be hidden. Her birth, all in her beautiful vestment, is an Oireachtas vestment, where Oireachtas means both assembly and sovereignty. The discarded sovereignty raiment offers another ghostly sighting of the sovereignty goddess and that idea of the Banish Rigi, the marriage. Behind the shape-shifting forms, the addressee swims in and out in view as a castle, a widowed woman, a sunny bright hill, is Mór Muin, the sovereignty goddess of the Ogan Ocht, whose seat is Cashel and whose line Macorhig belongs to. The fertility of land and sea that marked Macorhig's reign, the lawn, the Eask, Gach, Inver, Fui, under him every estuary was flush with fish, and the countryside's present desolation are both alike confirmation of his fear flathaman and the earth's reciprocal flowering and withering with it. I want to give you one last quote from this. Again, the mention of sheath, which is important. We have that sense of the same telluric energies. But this is really interesting, I think. So this is Fionn Lafnan Leric sheath, Fá Skilter Skjol Chuig Kriha. This is in the same year as The Fairy Queen is published in London. And this is a poet who lives a morning's ride from Kilcolman. And he says the land of Lowin of the fairy hills, theme of many a tale in foreign lands, or literally, whose stories are disseminated abroad. Now that its shepherd lives not, all men attack us. It's a really interesting suggestion. These guys knew what was up, and I have no doubt that word would have come that crazy poet in Kilcolman might have been up to something. At the very end of the poem, O'Donnell laments, as you see, that the land is left without an heir. That would present no problem under Gaelic law, where you didn't have heirs, and where the successor, the Tánaiste, was chosen by the Derivina or the Sept. But Elizabeth I's regrant of Clancarthy land to Donal in 1565 bound him to English inheritance law, and the colonial authorities were closing in. They imprisoned his son Tig in Dublin Castle. They locked up his daughter Ellen in Cork and attempted to marry her off to an English planter, Sir Valentine Browne. Tig escaped to France, from where soon news would travel back of his death, prompting 2 exquisite elegies. Ellen also escaped and married Fineen Macorhig, elected as by the clan, ignoring surrender and regrant, as Donal's successor. But to block Fineen's pathway to succession, Sir George Carew committed Fineen to the Tower of London in 1601. There he spent the remaining 40 years of his life writing a history of Ireland of which only a few sheets have survived. And so, in a perfect illustration of how surrender and regrant worked in practice, the Sept lands of Clancarthy reverted to the crown. The vultures had been gathering for some time. 2 examples from the deep map of the MacMorris project. The first one is Sir Edward Fenton, a soldier who was camped near there, and he says the castle is called Paulish, and he kind of thinks, oh, that means palace. So he says the Earl of Cloncarthy's house, called the palace a name very unfit for so beggarly a building, not answerable to a mean farmer's house in England. And his entertainment, much like his dwelling, so utterly dismissive. But then look what creeps in. Nigh unto our camp was the loch lane wherein much pearl is found. Always on the lookout. And here we have William Herbert. He must be the greediest of all of these planters. So here he's writing to Walsingham, "For that I mean to take but 6,000 acres within the county of Kerry, and am desirous to have other 6,000 acres in the county of Desmond, after the Earl of Cloncar's death, imagine. I beseech your honourable favour, and furthermore to Her Majesty, that I may have Castleloch, the palace, and Ballycarbery, with 6,000 acres of land about them. I write this timely, lest some other should make suit for them first." He's the fellow who really had scrawled in County Kerry, desired by Mr. Herbert, and Mr. Herbert had got it. But that wasn't enough for him. Anyway, he'd retreated from Ireland by the time Cloncarthy actually died. So now that the Crown had finally got its hands on Cloncarthy land, it set up a commission, the Cloncarthy Survey, to map and give a valuation of the property that they had created through that legal wheeze of 1565. The survey would provide a framework, and this is from its terms of action, whereby the country may be distributed to English people, unquote. But before Ivro could be divvied up into plantation acres, customary benefits and kind had first to be translated into monetary values. The surveyors had to put figures on everything. And this, if you ever want a really dense piece and utterly fascinating at the same time piece of reading, this is the Cloncarthy Survey. They're basically trying to turn everything into pounds, shillings, and white groats. Customary benefits, rents in kind, everything like that has a monetary value. And that very definitely included the natural world. Here's from the survey again. There are goodly timber woods in those lands lying in the half-barony of Glentheruch, fit for ship timber, pipe, staves, and clapboard, and lie near the portable river of Canmara. The river has many uses, but it's just, in this imagining, the portable river of Canmara. There is thought to be a mine of tin or lead upon these lands. There breed upon the woods of these lands an eyrie or two of goshawks. And again, there's that hope that there are pearls somewhere. As land had earlier been turned into property, so now trees, fish, and hawks are being turned into merchantable commodities. As Michael Cronin says in An Ghaeilge agus an Ecoliocht, I quote him, "The Tudor experiment in extraction makes Ireland the ideal laboratory for a form of ecological dispossession that will be replayed endlessly in various corners of empire. A laboratory for inventing property turns, as surely as night follows day, into a laboratory for new extractive logics of colonial capitalism." Soon, the woods would be cleared, helped on their way by Sir William Petty, who managed to add lands in South Kerry to the, wait for it, 270,000 acres he awarded himself while conducting the Down Survey. Very soon, the goshawks would be extinct. There are still no goshawks in Ireland. But I'm reluctant to end with extraction and extinction. A late 16th century elegy remembers MacCorrig as Donal Og the Hardísh Mná, Donal Og, beloved of women, which is an acknowledgement of his reputation as a love poet. Two of his surviving poems are delicate examples of Dánta Grá, the love poems. The third, however, Fir an Tí ag Selig son Sliav, the men of the household hunting on the mountain, is perhaps the most exquisite love poem of all, radiating a deep and attentive engagement with the natural world. I'll read the first stanza in Irish because it is so beautiful. Ní sra lua ach mín lin vaul, even go cuach o sa cion, bor na scóf o scólain town, the hon da na foilain fion. It is not a swift stream, just a still, languid pool, lovely the cuckoo's call overhead. A wave-rippled shadow on the surface darkens the plumage of the bright gulls. Bees on blue-green branches, honey intensifying their high spirits. From atop the sweet-smelling trees, apples float across the pool in the lawn. Apples on the expanse of the lawn, and nuts in clusters on limber branches. Skittish doves in the heat of the day, pegging nuts at one another. Here is the work of a keen observer whose intimacy with the natural world is wry and affectionate. Maccorrig's sensibility recognizes and gives expression to the independent, self-pleasing worlds of non-human creatures. Bees are endowed with manma, mind or spirit, and the giddy doves play only to amuse themselves. So, I hope I haven't gone on too long. I am coming to an end. What are we to do with this stuff? I mean, we can lay into it, certainly. For its gender politics, we can denounce the androcentrism of their impulse to anthropomorphize the earth, and we can certainly balk at the airy-fairiness of it all. Even more fundamentally, for us, schooled in logics of property and extraction, piloted in early modern Ireland, these poems are just deeply weird. But on the other hand, as Polanyi pointed out, and I quote him, to isolate what we call land and form a market for it was perhaps the weirdest of the undertakings of our ancestors. One of the great successes of people like the ancestors who dreamt up schemes such as surrender and regrant to privatize a world and turn it into property, lay in making that deeply weird maneuver seem the most natural thing on earth. But the discourses assembled in early modernity are now disaggregating. Now, as one after another, we crash through the safe limits of most Earth systems, we have choices to make. We can embrace nihilism and chaos and test the notion that we own the Earth to breaking point, crying, "Drill, baby, drill." Or in resisting, we can be fortified by the fact that other ways of being in the world have always been possible and remain possible. And we shouldn't be shy about re-enchanting the world just a little. We can look at the earth knowing that the notion that we own it is an invention rather than a reality. And we can work for a world where political success is measured, as in this late 16th century inauguration ode by, I quote, Dord biach os barif fiad luth brak food inver, the bees buzzing above the tops of woods, trout moving everywhere in the estuaries. Thank you.
Simply extraordinary. I was commenting with Joe Nugent next to me that you had us all in just rapt attention for this time, listening to not only the concept to us, but of course the beautiful reading of the poetry.
Yeah, it is so
Thank you.
beautiful.
It's just absolutely right. And that's what's I feel a little transported this evening here. It's a little awkward to maybe translate, but we'll call this a dialogue, right? So I don't know, we have, I'm sure, some people who want to say some things, ask some things of Pat. One over there? Yes, Michael, please.
Thank you so much for a really interesting and informative talk. My question is, and somewhat playing devil's advocate, because I agree a lot with your line of thinking, but what might you say to those who would suggest that the poems from these Gaelic poets represent the perspective of the Gaelic elite?
They do, of course. They're paid for by the Gaelic elite, but they also have an independence of mind. And I think that what is being, these strange channelings of, for example, fairy notions that the Tuatha Dé Danann, these are all good Catholics. In fact, these are all good Counter-Reformation Catholics as well. They're using this as a way of thinking. It is, for them, an abstract language, I think. And they're watching. One of those poems is written in the mid-17th century. They're watching what is happening, and they are commenting on it. So I think you are, and remember, they're counselors as well. They're not propagandists. They are offering advice, and they can see the way the wind is blowing. This is not actually, no people on earth embraced private property and all that came with it, like the Irish. They had several attempts. It was one of the great colonial maneuvers repeatedly. So, the Land Acts of the 19th century do exactly the same thing. You keep the peasants from becoming rebels by giving them a 40-acre farm. So that greed is there right from the start. Macquarie does not want to do surrender and grant, but some people rushed into the opportunity to now hive off this land for yourself and your sons. And so I think the poets are commenting on that. They're not just tools of propaganda, I think. I think these are extraordinarily subtle meditations on what's going on. And I think that whole thing that I was talking about earlier about seeing them as some kind of strange fossilized things completely ignores the thinking that they're doing very powerfully, I think, on what is the land, what is our relationship with it.
Thank you, Pat. That was brilliant. I just have a question. It kind of leads into this question that just came up, but a little different. So these poems that you were just reading aloud, at the time they were being written and, of course, commenting or kind of, like you were saying, and also taking up a different space when they were being shared, when they were being created and entering into the space of the court and the places. Like, what was the space that text or that orality was supposed to be doing? How would it, and of course that's an impossible question to ask, but like where would it be amongst those people in that community? Like, how would it be holding space in a way that perhaps we're kind of looking back to and thinking about in the present? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, and a question I cannot answer. And it's one that I think about so often. So we know that the language in which the poets are writing, we cannot accept if we have evidence of, it's written for a lord who reigned between this era and that. Just linguistically, we would have no way of knowing that it wasn't written in 1200, 1300, 1400, 1500, 1600. The language is preserved in these bardic schools. So by the time it's being read in the mid-17th century, according to the fiendish metrical rules as well that require it to use ever more obscure vocabulary, and it's not being read by the poet because he's far too grand to read it. It's being read by a rachra with the accompaniment of a harpist, etc., etc. What is sounding, I think, is oracular. It is so archaic that people are only getting every few words. How much is comprehended in the moment of performance, I rather doubt. So I think that what is striking, though, is in a lot of the poems, for example, of Thaig Dal, that I know you're familiar with yourself, he talks to his patrons as fellow readers of people who've discussed books. So I think what happens when you discuss it with fellow poets, visiting poets are always coming through, and the Lord the next day. And some of the women in the green on, I think that's where a more interesting thing happens. So I think of the night of revelry in the hall, and the logs on the fire, and the noise and the clanking of tankards and all of that, and then this kind of extraordinary performance happens, which you kind of half understand. That's probably not where, that's just, I would say, a performance of power, really, rather than a moment of intellectual exchange. But this is so contradictory. We have no accounts of what that was like, really.
Good question. Time for one or two more. Marcus, please.
Pat, thanks. I think it's fantastic to bring Polynya into analysis of poetry, and wonderful to do so, interdisciplinary in a way. And I'm wondering whether this sort of points to the question of the political economy of poetry within Ireland, and if you'd have some comments to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I have addressed that in a way with the previous two questions. The poet himself, interestingly, is a property owner. He's entitled, under Bardic law, Brehon law, sorry, he is entitled to a castle and all of that. So he's a significant person. And what happens after the collapse of the Bardic order and the Gaelic order, in a sense, you know, with after the flight of the Earls in 1607, is very often these poets who have been maligned and hunted as well, because they're seen as so central to the regime that the colonists are fighting. There's a price on their heads. There endless edicts are published calling for them to be brought in and so forth. So there's a rush in the fields, or the kind of pardons, the Book of Pardons of the early 17th century. There's a rush. Most of our information about the poets, where they were living and all of that, is their appeal for pardon and to be re-granted their castles, or which have been taken as part of O'Neill lands for the plantation of Ulster or something like that, and they're trying to reclaim it. So their position is really difficult. It's very compromised in that sense. They're deeply in this system, and then that system has collapsed, and now they have to weather. It's very interesting how many poets are reduced in circumstances in a generation. Two things happen. One is Moinwira O'Higgin is actually, and this is why he's so embarrassed about all of that sex stuff in his poem, is a priest in somewhere in the Low Countries, I'm not sure where. So he's of the great bardic line of the O'Higgin, and so that's the first option, is there's an entire generation that just changes around 1603 from being a bardic poet to being a priest. These are the educated people, and they can see, but like in Ireland in the 1990s, pharmacy was the thing. Don't mind being a doctor. There's much more money in pharmacy. And people getting the points for pharmacy was the big thing. And I think, so the bards see that there's no future for their sons in what was a very lucrative position up onto that, and they become priests. And the others become basically small farmers. So, yeah, I mean, the question of their own imbrication in this is interesting as well.
I'm going to give the privilege of to our introducer of being the concluder for questioning tonight, and then we have you on campus for a few more weeks, Pat.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You're not
okay.
going to kick me
So
out yet,
good.
yeah.
No, that's to say, I feel, to say that conversation continues. Pat's not going. Sometimes we bring in lecturers, of course, and they go on the next day and week. But Pat, you're with us here.
Oh, yeah, very happy to. I'm
so
always
please,
happy
I would encourage
to.
those of you, and I can help you get in touch with Pat, because I'm sure there are more questions. But Guy?
So Pat, I'm thinking it's about periodization and finality, which we often do in history. We see kind of closed periods and move to another period. So we have this period in which you've recovered and brought us back to this period of a concept of communal ownership of land and a different kind of relationship with nature. And you're saying, look, we have lessons to learn. We can go back. There could have been a different future. We can go back and we can rediscover, we can recharge it, we can use it as a modern resource. But let's go back for a minute. And we have this notion of the end of the Gaelic order and it disappears. And like you say, people are complicit in its disappearance and it goes away. And yet they're doing this remarkable rethinking in this period, right? Where does that continue? Because some of it does continue in the 18th century. It doesn't dissipate. They've challenged it and it doesn't disappear. It does. So where does continuity fit into your story, if you're looking?
Well, I think that story that I was telling about the movement onto the continent is where it happens. And it gets turned into a lot of very different discourses. Unfortunately, a lot of it gets into kind of counter-Reformation discourses and gets caught up in that kind of theology and antagonism. Particularly, it gets caught up in things like debates about the Immaculate Conception and things like that. So the successors to these bardic poets in the 17th century are involved in all of these Latin controversies on the continent. So that seems to me, in one way, I mean, so there's this tremendous ferment right from Prague, Irish College in Prague, through Lisbon, through Spain, etc., etc. So all of this is happening. But it does get dissipated, I think, in a way. No bardic poem that I know is an original 16th century copy. Very few are 17th century copies. Most of them are copied in the 18th and even 19th century. So somewhere underground, there are people who are reading this, and they're certainly transcribing it. They make mistakes which indicate that word has fallen out of use and they don't quite know what it means. But there is an engagement with it in that period. And so, I mean, even just, I was thinking today that idea of the sheath, the fairy, as this kind of telluric figure, becomes a Spervan, the sky woman fairy in the Aisling poets. It's kind of interesting that it takes to the air. And so there is a transmutation, but I think there are continuities if we start looking for them so that the movement from this is the end of this complex metrical poetry, certainly. But in its movement to our own, into the song metrics, some of that intellectual energy, I think, is, but I'm not a historian of the later 17th century, so I don't know quite where it goes. How much of that is ideologically driven as opposed to, and out of these arcane discourses? I'm not sure. I can't imagine. And yet, all of these words, those names for Ireland that we have seen in this, these ideas are still being circulated. People, what Angela Burke said about this web of connections, these points. People know things. There's a really wonderful description in the very late 17th century of a number of people who are arraigned and taken to court in Castle Island. And they're arraigned for doing something really, really terrible, which is they just scale the bark off the oak trees in Yveraw. And the plaintiffs, you should see the lineup of them. There's a fellow called, Dominic Moriarty, who calls himself the Moriarty. Patrick O'Sullivan, who calls himself O'Sullivan Moore. And there's somebody else who calls himself. So these people have a sense, although they are arraigned as really lowly vandals. And they explain that if they're not going to have their patrimony, no one is going to have their patrimony. So that sense of they know themselves, nobody in the courthouse recognizes it, but they know themselves that they are the real aristocracy. And so I think there is a wide dissemination. People know themselves that they were bardic poets once, or they had a law school. So where that goes is really interesting. Sorry, can't answer it more fully than that.